Dragon Age: The Veilguard is a radical departure from the current AAA norm of releasing games on PC with half-baked or broken technical quality. Dragon Age is polished with a smart user experience, it is smooth where it counts, and like a true PC game, it offers a noticeable higher fidelity than the console version that plays into the strengths of the PC platform. Dragon Age feels like a PC game, and it deserves celebration on release, and that's what this video is about today. How and why I think Dragon Age is a great PC release, and how you can run it in an optimized way to get good performance on lower end CPUs and GPUs. So, why do I think Dragon Age is so good on PC?
Yeah, it's unreal.
No, it's not, and that is actually what is great. This game is running DICE's Frostbite engine, and it is the first Frostbite game I've looked at on PC since the Dead Space remake, which we all know how that turned out. Dragon Age thankfully doesn't make the same mistakes that the Dead Space remake made. As it starts up, it has a lengthy shader pre-compilation step that took around 4.5 minutes on a Ryzen 7 7800X3D and around 10 minutes on a lower-end Ryzen 5 3600. In my experience of play, this shader compilation step at the beginning of the game does seem to capture all the necessary amount of shaders that are needed to have a smooth experience in the game with no intrusive stutter when new effects or objects are shown up on screen. I haven't played the full game, of course, so I can't speak to everything, but it seems to be good based upon at least the first 5 to 6 hours of play. I prefer a lengthy shader compilation step in the beginning of a game if it means no intrusive frame time hitches, and in comparison to a asynchronous shader compilation like that found in the Nixie's ports on PC, this upfront shader compilation will save CPU time during gameplay, which could potentially lead to smoother gameplay, especially for lower end CPUs like the Ryzen 5 3600 that I always use. That CPU is now rather old and I would consider it pretty low end now, but it still can maintain a healthy 60 FPS in nearly every scene in this game with only a handful of exceptions. A few areas in the game when traversing the terrain can cause a few single long frame times on the Ryzen 5 3600 above 16 milliseconds, but they are extremely few and far between, and with good FPS capping like we're showing here, utilizing VSync for example, those frame time spikes can be nearly completely hidden due to the effect of triple buffering, and a lessened burden on the CPU since you're not running flat out unlocked. With capping your frame rate in this game, even low-end CPUs like this, combined with optimized settings, can maintain a very smooth 60 FPS experience. I definitely want to highlight this point here in this video, as smooth terrain traversal and a good 60 FPS is not something found in many games as of late. And here, even this old, crusty CPU can manage it nearly all the time, only with some minor exceptions. In fact, the only other minor exception in this game is the intro, which seems to be the heaviest CPU area I have found so far. Basically, as soon as you get control of your character there, I found that this one area, this little intro area, is the area where the 3600 cannot maintain 60 FPS, where it drops into the 50s there, while CPU limited. It's only in this immediate staging area though, in the intro, and after that, the game's base performance on this CPU has a healthy margin below 16.6 millisecond frame times, so you can get a good 60 FPS experience nearly everywhere. That scaling goes in the other direction as well. If you have a top-end CPU, this game will fly with generally stable low frame times and very high frame rates, where I see nearly 2.3 times the average frame rate on a Ryzen 7 7800X3D in a like-for-like scenario. After having played a number of hours of Dragon Age: The Veilguard, I will say the game is smooth running on PC with the right settings, and you can only find extremely rare one-off small frame time blips. It is in stark contrast to many other modern games on PC and even console, and that smoothness greatly colored my experience of the game for the better. I was not constantly being ripped out of the experience of playing the game due to frame time hitches, and that definitely cannot be said of many games releasing this year. Smoothness is one of the things that defines the user experience in the game, as well as a Class A menu system and options. BioWare has elected to use the real-time Nixie-style menus that I always praise, where you can edit the graphical options in real time, seeing their effect on visuals and performance immediately. Only two options require restarts, textures and level of detail, but even with those 2 exceptions, you will find mostly everything in-game, and you'll also have good information about what is being changed and how it affects your PC due to a helpful VRAM meter and clues in the descriptions as to which subcomponents of your PC will be affected by the graphical change. That is good stuff. I'm also a big fan of the types of options we have here. I love that there is an adjustable dynamic resolution scaling option, allowing you to get the best image quality possible at your desired frame rate, with you being able to choose even the minimum resolution scaling possible. That is exactly what I want to see in a PC game. I also love that there is an explicit multi-stage scaler here. For example, you can set the game to 4K, set DLSS to balanced, for example, and then set the res scale to 67%. That means you'd have this chain of scaling, 835p internally reconstructed to 1440p, which is then simply upscaled to 4K and composited on a 4K user interface. So you can get a 4K HUD here really easily. And you can even go in the other direction here, downsampling from a resolution scale above 100% and even adding in reconstruction to that too. The options give you the flexibility here in this game to make the game perform how you want, and there's also meaningful performance scaling here that I will talk about later in the vid when I get to optimized settings.
There are essentially 3 core areas where the PC version improves over the console version due to the options menu. The first of which is in image quality and performance with the right PC, which is pretty expected in this day and age. With DLSS and stronger GPUs, you can get a crisper, more stable image at a higher frame rate than the FSR and lower resolutions you see on console. That is par for the course, and nothing too surprising there for many games on PC. The bigger wins from the menu come from the settings that are higher on PC, such as terrain decoration, which controls the amount of scattered objects like plants, rocks, and more across the game world. Here, the PS5 version at least appears to be the closest to the high setting, where the ultra setting above that adds a healthy amount of more vegetation in the world, making the natural areas look denser and less video gamey as a result. This seems to apply to every scene in the game I've seen so far and is a nice advantage. The increases to ray tracing fidelity though are perhaps the biggest upgrades to fidelity on PC. The first of which is that ray tracing can now apply everywhere. On the console version, the selective ray tracing option is being used, which only turns on the ray tracing effects for a few scenes, where there is enough performance headroom to run it. Based on my experience so far, that actually means very few scenes tend to employ the ray tracing, as the selective option tends to turn it off more often than it does turn it on, especially in larger outdoor scenes with vegetation. RT reflections are culled there on the console version, while on PC you can force them on at all times as we see here, so the water looks better. The same seems to apply to ray traced ambient occlusion, though as we can see here, it can be harder to spot for reasons that I will get into later. So you will be able to see enhancements from RT in every scene in the game, should you so wish on PC. On top of this, the game also has an ultra setting for ray tracing, which has numerous positive effects for its quality at a performance cost. The first thing the ultra setting does is dramatically improve the internal resolution of ray traced reflections. You can see that in this scene here. Without ultra ray tracing like we find on the PS5 version, this body of water here shows obvious aliasing and a low resolution look, which in motion looks flickery and chunky. With ultra ray tracing, that is more or less completely cleaned up, and it looks all the better for it. I like that Dragon Age does not artificially cap ray tracing quality at a console level for performance reasons, unlike so many other titles. Another thing this ultra setting does is it boosts the range of RT reflection. This is most relevant in scenes like this one here with the water and far distant objects, where the default quality setting as found on PS5 lacks the reflection of the tower at a distance here, which is then added in the reflection with the ultra setting on PC. For ambient occlusion, the difference the ultra setting has is more subtle. The ultra setting there just seems to refine AO quality in some way, which produces a different look. Perhaps with less aliasing, but in general I had a hard time telling what it is exactly improving. Here I wish they took the RTAO actually one step further with a longer ray distance on the PC version when you selected Ultra. As of the moment, it is pretty short. A number of scenes, even with RTAO on, as I'm showing here, have a flatter shaded look, like in this gallery, which is in shadow. With a longer ray distance and RTAO on, this area could almost look skylit in a naturally shaded way. Same with this jail cell here. Due to RTAO having a short ray distance, it looks a bit undershaded and overlit in an unnatural way. Here I would love it if they upped RTAO with that ultra setting to help fill in the gaps, even if it meant a hit to performance. In spite of that smaller complaint, thanks to options like the Ultra RT setting,
Dragon Age is going to scale well into the future on PC,
and it will give PCs in the here and now some extra challenge if you so wish it. And that is good.
Well, we're not in Minrathous anymore.
I know these trees. This is Arlethan Forest.
And there's your ritual.
Thanks to the competent settings menu in Dragon Age, the Veilguard, it is actually rather easy to find optimized settings for yourself, but you can also get some great insight just by comparing the PC version to PS5 to see what PS5 uses to keep its frame rate up and maintain 60 FPS as much as possible in its performance mode. The devs have already made optimized settings essentially for us, it's just that they're on PlayStation 5. Dynamic resolution scaling should be at the top of your list for optimized settings as PS5 uses it heavily, with performance mode there scaling down to as low as almost 500p to keep performance up as close to 60 as it possibly can. On PC, I recommend using it as well, though it does have some caveats on PC, namely with the upscaler you choose. First, on XeSS, I have not been able to get DRS to engage, as the version of XeSS seems to be an old vintage here. Secondly, DLSS works with DRS, but its bottom resolution is always 50% output axis resolution, or performance mode. So if you use FSR, it can technically go much lower in resolution when it needs to hit the targeted frame rate, which should be obvious in this side-by-side I am showing here. DLSS with DRS is recovering some of that frame rate versus the static resolution, but FSR is doing it much better because it can drive down the resolution much further than just 50% axis res. The slider I showed off earlier for minimum res only applies to FSR at the moment, unfortunately. The top resolution DRS scales to is controlled by the level of FSR or DLSS you choose, but with a limit to quality mode, essentially. FSR native AA works, but DLAA does not. Basically, there are a couple of limits on how DRS works, and the menu is not explicit enough at the moment, I would say, to let you know that those limitations are there. So hopefully they can change that in a patch to make it more flexible. For example, allowing XeSS to work with DRS by upgrading its version to the latest, and by allowing DLSS to scale based upon the resolution percentage slider. Coming to ray tracing, you have to consider two things. First is GPU. Looking at the reflections in this image, we can see that turning on reflections is not too expensive on the RTX 4060 at this res. Just 22% performance cost for getting rid of many SSR artifacts. Yet the reflections stay just as chunky as they are with SSR. Increasing the res of reflections has a significant cost over being turned off, decreasing performance by 36% there. Based upon what I showed off about RTAO earlier with its low ray distance, I find it is not necessarily worth the cost at all on a mid-range GPU, unless you're fine with low frame rates. Here I find it hard to appreciate its positive impacts versus its performance. I would say for 60 FPS targets on GPUs like the RTX 4060, ignore the RT, but if you're going for 40 or 30 FPS, then the Ultra RT reflections are great. An RTX 3080 or 4070 tier GPU can go for Ultra RT and attempt for 60 FPS as I see it, while perhaps ignoring RTAO. For CPUs, RT performance cost is also important. You're going to need better than Zen 2 as I show here, where a Ryzen 5 3600, for example, with RT enabled, will drop below 60 FPS in a number of game scenes. So if you want to attempt 60 FPS with RT on, at least have a Zen 3 or later equivalent. Your next port of call should be terrain decoration quality. As I described earlier in the video, this changes the amount of rocks, twigs, vegetation, and leaves scattered about in the more open sections of the game, and has a noticeable performance hit on Ultra, 4 to 5%, depending on the scene. Like the PS5 version, I recommend the high setting for optimized settings to make sure the open areas of the game run as best as they can. Level of detail should also be dropped down to high for a similar reason, as it offers a nice performance bump, but has far less quality loss on high than the last setting even, though mid to low setting here removes a lot of the mid to distant geometry, like these birds just hanging out over here. Curiously, this level of detail setting also affects the quality of shadows cast from trees if you notice. Look at the shadow on the ground here. It makes them partially simplified on high and lower versus ultra. Here I noticed that the PS5's performance and fidelity mode both appear to use the level of detail of high for world objects, but the fidelity mode has a custom setting where its shadows from trees use the ultra level of detail setting. So it's a mixed preset not attainable on PC. Either way, use high here for optimized settings. Since I don't recommend RTAO, which type of HBAO should you use? Well, here the full setting obviously offers more coverage and greater image contrast, but in the end, SSAO is just a hack, and it's hard to know which one is actually more physically accurate. So it's up to taste, but to keep the same settings as console, use the HBAO full setting. The post-process settings control the quality of motion blur and depth of field. Zooming in, one can see how Ultra resolves better bokeh shapes than the settings below it, but at a hefty performance cost in this scene of around 11% over the medium or high settings. As far as I see it, I recommend the medium or high setting, which are pretty similar. That's also around where the PlayStation 5 console version appears to be in its fidelity mode, where we can see Ultra having many more samples than that version when counting in the depth of field here. Lighting quality is another simple win here, where this controls shadow quality, and going down from ultra to high only introduces subtle quality loss to the shadows, and it's honestly hard to see what that is without rapidly switching back and forth. Medium and low, on the other hand, make visible concessions to quality at a distance or up close, and are not big performance wins, unlike the 4% win of high. So here, use high. After this setting, the rest of the settings I don't think should be changed too much, really. First, starting with strand hair. Strand hair in this game makes it so that the hair is rendered with real geometry that automatically LODs at a distance and has much superior shadowing, lighting, and shading. And it has far less artifacts than the hair card system that is used with it turned off. Yes, you can save some performance from scene to scene with it turned off, but I would really only use this on Steam Deck-like devices, as the hair rendering in this game with hair strands on is top-notch. I purposefully chose a character with long hair and curls, as I knew this is technically hard to do. And there was almost never an instance in-game where I thought her long curly hair moved in a strange or odd way. I thought it was really good looking. It's a real highlight of this game's graphics, and I definitely recommend using that strand hair for optimized settings. As mentioned though, the other settings really shouldn't be touched. Settings like sky quality and volumetric quality curiously had very little measurable impact on performance, and I actually had trouble discerning differences between the quality levels when toggling it, even after restarting the game. Here, either the setting change is very subtle, or it's changing something in an area I could not find, or they are perhaps not functioning correctly. Either way, you can probably leave this on Ultra, as far as I can tell. Same with the visual effects quality. That only had minor differences in the visuals of particles, and it's not worth any performance win. That is also true for terrain quality, which changes the amount of tessellation on the ground using hardware tessellation stage. I think it costs next to nothing on PC, so I recommend Ultra. Here the console version kind of strangely reduces this to the medium setting based upon the pattern I can find on the ground. And I didn't expect that given how cheap it is on PC. Lastly, there's the texture quality setting, which is especially important for 8GB GPUs. As we can see here, 8GB GPUs should not use the Ultra texture setting at 1440p, for example, as it will run worse dipping into system memory. Quite a good deal worse performance there. Interestingly, it also seems like 8GB GPUs should perhaps not use the high setting, even though it runs fine and the in-game meter says it should be fine. But if you look here, we can see that the textures are not loading properly on the main character, unlike on medium, where it loaded in just fine. I saw this after multiple game restarts in the scene here, so I recommend the medium setting for 8GB GPUs. But if you do happen to see aggressive texture loading while running around the game world on medium, perhaps try out the less aggressive high setting there. And with that being said, this is the list of optimized settings for this game. Similar enough to what we find on PS5 in its performance mode, with a higher optimized setting list there for those who want to target 40 or 30 FPS on a mid-range GPU, or 60 FPS on higher tier ones like RTX 3080. Altogether, we can see some nice gains in cinematics, like with the RTX 4060 here, where over the cutscene, we can see our derived optimized settings without dynamic res running on average 12 to 13% better, with scarcely a difference in visuals, and I think that is definitely worth it for this GPU. Adding in dynamic resolution targeting 60 FPS brings those moments below 60 above, and we see an average 22% performance win over Ultra without RT in this scene, and it makes the game look great.
All right, I'll take it from here.
Getting to the end of this video, I can definitely say I like Dragon Age the Veilguard's PC version on a technical level. There's a nice settings menu here with generally good settings, with some room for improvement though, but it still scales nicely above the consoles. Generally, we also have great frame times here, even on low-end CPUs. And I really do wish more games came out in a polished state like this. I really wish they did. Anyway, if you did like this video, hit that like button, subscribe, ring the bell, support on Patreon, comment below, and as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.